The morning they put Arthur in the ground, I stood at his graveside watching my son David check his phone. 82 years old I am, and I've seen enough funerals to know when someone's heart isn't in it. But this was his father we were burying, and there he stood, 52 years old and fidgeting like a schoolboy during Sunday service. My name is Margaret Calloway, and I've lived in Millfield, New Hampshire, my entire married life, 53 years in this little town where everyone knows your business before you do. The Methodist Church was packed that Tuesday morning. Arthur had been the bank manager at First National for 30 years, and folks remembered. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop brought those white lilies he always admired. Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, spoke about Arthur's kindness during the recession when half the town couldn't pay their bills on time. But David kept glancing at his watch. When Reverend Matthews asked if the family wanted to say anything, I nudged my son gently. He cleared his throat, mumbled something about a good man and missed by all, then stepped back so fast I nearly stumbled. The whole thing lasted maybe 30 seconds. 30 seconds for the man who'd raised him, coached his little league team, and paid for that fancy business degree that hadn't done him much good. After the service, people lingered the way they do in small towns. Evelyn Parker, my bridge partner for 20 years, squeezed my hand and whispered, "You call me if you need anything, Maggie. Anything at all." Old Doc Morrison, who delivered David all those years ago, patted my shoulder and said Arthur was the finest man he'd known. These people, my neighbors, my friends, they saw me. They remembered I was still here, still breathing, still needing kindness. David, though, he was already walking toward his fancy BMW, talking on that phone of his. "Work emergency?" he called over his shoulder when I tried to catch his attention. "A work emergency." On the day we buried his father, I watched him drive away without a backward glance, leaving me standing there in my best black dress, holding a casserole from Mrs. Rodriguez, and wondering how I'd raised such a stranger. The ladies from church, bless them, they made sure I got home safely. Dorothy Walsh drove me in her old Buick while her daughter followed with all the food people had brought. They stayed for a while, making sure I wasn't alone, making sure I had everything I needed. Real concern, not the distracted kind David had been showing lately. It was when they finally left, when the house fell quiet, except for the ticking of Arthur's old grandfather clock, that I felt it, not just the grief. I'd been expecting that. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. A restlessness. A tiny seed of, what? Disappointment? No. It was stronger than that. It was the beginning of understanding that my son saw me as something to be managed, not someone to be loved. I sat in Arthur's chair, still smelling his pipe tobacco in the fabric, and noticed my purse on the side table. There was an envelope sticking out, cream-colored paper, expensive looking. I'd forgotten all about it in the chaos of the last few weeks. Mr. Bennett from the law office had handed it to me after the will reading, said it was separate from everything else, something Arthur had left specifically for me. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out. Not from age, my hands are steadier than most women half my age, from something else. A feeling that whatever was inside that envelope was going to change everything. The return address read Bennett and Associates Legal Services, the same firm that had handled Arthur's business affairs for decades. I turned it over in my hands, this envelope that seemed to weigh more than it should. Arthur had always been a methodical man, careful about details. If he'd gone to the trouble of having Mr. Bennett prepare something separate, something private, there was a reason. Arthur never did anything without a reason. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times. David hadn't called, hadn't stopped by to check on his widowed mother on her first evening alone, but somehow, sitting there with that mysterious envelope in my lap, I didn't feel as alone as I expected. I felt curious. For the first time in months, I felt like something was about to happen. I looked at the envelope one more time, then set it carefully on the table beside me. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow I'd open it. Tonight, I just wanted to sit with Arthur's memory and the strange comfort of knowing he'd left me one more surprise. After 53 years of marriage, he was still looking out for me, even if our son wasn't. Morning came too early and too quiet. I'd always been an early riser, but without Arthur's gentle snoring beside me, 5:30 felt like the middle of the night. I made coffee in our old percolator, none of those fancy machines for me, and sat at the kitchen table with that envelope, watching the sun come up over Miller's Ridge. My fingers trembled just slightly as I opened it. Inside was a folded letter in Arthur's careful handwriting, and beneath it, official-looking papers with seals and stamps. The letter was dated just 6 months ago, right after his first stroke. The one that scared us both, though we never talked about it directly. Arthur wasn't one for dramatic conversations, but he was always practical. "My dearest Maggie," it began, and I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting across from me. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're alone with that boy of ours who never did learn the value of a dollar or the importance of taking care of his mother. I've done something that might surprise you, something I've kept secret because I wanted it to be yours and yours alone." I had to stop reading and wipe my eyes. Even in death, Arthur knew me better than anyone alive. He'd seen what I'd been trying not to see, that David viewed me as a burden, not a blessing, that my own son was already calculating what he could get from my grief. The letter continued. "Remember when we were young, just married, and I told you a woman should always have something of her own, something no one could take away? Well, I made sure you do. Look at the papers, Maggie. Really look at them." With shaking hands, I unfolded the official documents: property deed, transfer of ownership, legal descriptions full of metes and bounds and survey markers, but the address that stopped my heart: 27 Lighthouse Road, Millfield Harbor. I knew that address. We'd driven past that little coastal house hundreds of times over the years. Arthur always slowed down when we passed it, always made some comment about the ocean view or the way the morning light hit the windows. According to these papers, he'd bought it 3 years ago. Paid cash, $650,000. The deed was in my maiden name, Margaret Rose Sullivan, not Calloway. Sullivan, the name I'd carried for 22 years before I became Mrs. Arthur Calloway. He'd bought it and put it in a name that connected me to who I was before I became anyone's wife or mother. I sat there staring at those papers until the coffee went cold. $650,000. Arthur had somehow saved that much without me knowing, bought a house without me knowing, and kept it secret for 3 years. The same man who told me about every $10 purchase at the hardware store had managed to buy a house on the coast and never mentioned it. The letter wasn't finished. "I know you're wondering how, Maggie. Remember those business trips to Boston the last few years? I wasn't just visiting old colleagues. I was managing some investments, some things I kept separate from our regular accounts. Things David doesn't know about, and doesn't need to know about. The house is paid for, free and clear. The property taxes are current through next year. I've even had Mr. Bennett set up a small maintenance fund." My practical Arthur. Even in his secrets, he was thinking ahead, making sure details were handled. I could picture him making these arrangements, probably staying in that little hotel near the harbor, walking through the empty house and imagining me there, planning this gift for a future he wouldn't be part of. So I watched that boy of ours after my stroke, Maggie, watched how he talked about helping with our finances, about making decisions for us. He means well, I suppose, but he's never learned the difference between helping and taking over. This house is your insurance policy. Use it however you want. Live in it, rent it, sell it, but make that decision yourself, in your own time for your own reasons. The final paragraph nearly broke me. "You've spent 53 years taking care of everyone else, Maggie. Taking care of me, of David, of your mother when she got sick, of half the neighborhood when they needed help. Now take care of yourself. You're stronger and smarter than anyone gives you credit for, including me sometimes. Trust yourself. And if David gives you trouble about money or property or any of it, remember that you have options he doesn't know about. Love always, Arthur." I folded the letter carefully and looked out the window toward the harbor. I couldn't see it from here, but I knew it was there. I knew my house was there, waiting for me. Arthur's last gift wasn't just a house, it was independence. It was the knowledge that I had choices, that I wasn't as helpless or dependent as everyone seemed to think. For the first time since the funeral, I smiled, really smiled. David could take his time calling, could make his plans about helping me with my affairs. Let him think I was just a confused old widow who needed managing. Meanwhile, I'd have my secret, just like Arthur had his. I picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Bennett's office. It was time to visit my house. 2 weeks after the funeral, David finally decided to grace me with a visit. I saw his BMW pull into the driveway while I was watering the geraniums Arthur had planted for me last spring. Funny how he always found time for emergencies at work, but had to schedule time for his grieving mother. He came through the front door without knocking, just walked right in like he owned the place, which I was beginning to suspect he thought he did. "Mom," he called out, his voice carrying that tone people use when they think you can't hear properly. "We need to talk." I found him in the living room, looking around like he was appraising everything. His eyes lingered on Arthur's antique desk, the china cabinet my grandmother had left me, the Persian rug we'd bought on our 25th anniversary. Calculating. That's the word for it. My son was calculating the value of my life. "David, honey," I said, settling into my chair and putting on my best confused elderly mother voice. "How nice to see you. Can I make you some coffee? Some of those cookies from Hartley's bakery?" He waved me off impatiently. "Mom, we need to discuss your situation here. This house is too big for you now. Too much maintenance, too many expenses. I've been thinking." "You've been thinking?" I interrupted gently. "How thoughtful of you, dear." He missed the sarcasm entirely, launched right into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about downsizing and efficiency and making smart decisions for your future. The whole time, he's pacing around my living room, picking up Arthur's pipe, examining the silver picture frames, handling my things like they were already his. "There's this nice assisted living place in Concord," he continued. "Clean, safe, lots of activities for people your age. And Mom, if you sold this place, you'd have some money to work with. Maybe even enough to help me out with that business opportunity I mentioned." Ah, there it was. The real reason for his visit. David's restaurant supply business had been struggling for months. I knew that much from what little Arthur had told me, but I'd been playing the part of the sweet, slightly confused widow who didn't really understand business or money. Amazing how much people will tell you when they think you're not really listening. "A business opportunity?" I asked, blinking at him with wide, innocent eyes. "How exciting. Tell me about it, dear." He sat down then, leaning forward with that smile he'd used since he was 10 years old when he wanted something. "There's this restaurant chain looking to expand into northern New England. They need a regional distributor, someone with the capital to handle the initial investment. It's a sure thing, Mom. But I need about $200,000 to get started." $200,000. Nearly half of what this house might be worth, and he was talking about it like it was pocket change. I nodded along, asking simple questions, letting him explain how generous he was being by including me in such a wonderful opportunity. "Of course, you'd need to move somewhere more manageable first," he added, casually. "Free up that equity. I could help you handle all the paperwork, make sure you don't get confused by all the legal stuff." Legal stuff? I nearly laughed out loud. This from the boy whose father had to co-sign his car loans well into his 30s. But I just nodded and said I'd think about it, that it sounded very complicated, and I'd need time to understand it all. After he left in a hurry again, naturally, I called Evelyn Parker. Wednesday was bridge club, but I needed to talk to her sooner than that. "Evelyn," I said when she answered, "could you come over for coffee? I need some advice." 20 minutes later, she was sitting in my kitchen, her sharp blue eyes taking in everything I wasn't saying, along with everything I was. Evelyn had raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. She knew the signs of family trouble before most people knew there was a problem. "He wants you to sell," she said, after I'd given her the sanitized version of David's visit. It wasn't a question. "He says the house is too much for me," I replied carefully. "And I suppose he's offered to help manage the proceeds?" Evelyn's voice was dry as week-old toast. "Maggie, let me tell you something. When my Bill died, my youngest son started visiting twice a week, so attentive, so concerned about my welfare. Took me 3 months to realize he was going through Bill's desk, checking bank statements, making lists of what we owned." I poured more coffee, waiting. Evelyn had more to say. "Once they get their hands on your deeds, they never let go. Oh, they'll tell you it's for your own good, that they're protecting you from confusion or mistakes. But what they're really protecting you from is having any control over your own life." She reached across the table and patted my hand. "Don't sign anything without reading it 3 times and having someone else look at it too. Someone who doesn't stand to benefit." After Evelyn left, I sat in Arthur's study and opened the phone book. Bennett and Associates was still listed on Maple Street, same location they'd been for 40 years. I'd known Harold Bennett since David was in diapers. He'd handled Arthur's business affairs, written our wills, helped us navigate the legal maze when Arthur's mother passed away. If anyone would give me straight advice about protecting myself, it would be Harold Bennett, and if anyone would understand why I needed to keep certain assets private, it would be the lawyer who'd helped Arthur set up that very privacy. I picked up the phone and dialed. Time to find out exactly what my options were and what my son didn't need to know about them. Harold Bennett's office hadn't changed in 30 years. Same wood-paneled walls, same leather chairs that creaked when you sat down, same smell of old books and lemon oil. Even his secretary, Mrs. Pemberton, looked exactly the same, though she had to be pushing 80 herself. When I walked in that Thursday morning, she smiled and said, "Mrs. Calloway, Harold's expecting you. Go right in, dear." Harold stood up when I entered, and I was struck by how frail he looked. We were the same age, he and I, but lawyer's work had aged him differently than housework had aged me. Still sharp, though, his eyes were as keen as ever when he gestured to the chair across from his massive oak desk. "Margaret," he said, settling back into his chair. "I'm so sorry about Arthur. He was a good man, a careful man. I assume you've read his letter about the harbor property?" I nodded, pulling the envelope from my purse. "Harold, I need to understand what exactly Arthur set up for me, and I need to know how to protect it. My son has some ideas about my future that don't align with my own." Harold's eyebrows went up slightly. "David's being difficult?" "David thinks I should sell the house and move into assisted living so I can help fund his latest business venture," I said plainly. No point in sugarcoating it with Harold. He'd seen enough family disputes to know how these things went. "I see." Harold opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. "Well, let's discuss what Arthur arranged. The harbor property is titled solely in your maiden name. No joint ownership, no right of survivorship with anyone else. It's yours, free and clear. David has no legal claim to it whatsoever, and more importantly, he has no knowledge of it." He spread the papers across his desk, pointing to various sections. "Arthur also established a small trust fund for the property's maintenance and taxes. It's funded through some investments he made independently over the years. Nothing massive, but enough to cover upkeep for several years." "What about income potential?" I asked. Arthur's letter had mentioned using the house however I wanted, and I'd been thinking about that ever since. Harold smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "Now you sound like Arthur. Always thinking practically. That property is in an excellent location for seasonal rentals. The harbor area has become quite popular with summer visitors, leaf peepers in the fall, even winter visitors for the Christmas by the Sea Festival. Conservatively, you could probably clear $30,000 a year in rental income." $30,000 a year. On top of Arthur's pension and my Social Security, that would make me quite comfortable indeed. More than comfortable, it would make me independent. Completely, utterly independent of my son's ideas about what was best for me. "Harold, I want to set up a trust. Something that protects both properties, this house and the harbor house, from any future claims or complications. I'd been thinking about this since Evelyn's visit, and the idea had taken solid shape in my mind." "A revocable living trust would work well for your situation," Harold agreed. "You'd maintain complete control during your lifetime, but the assets would be protected from creditors, and you could specify exactly how you want them handled after you're gone." We spent the next hour discussing the details. Harold suggested language that would prevent any beneficiary from contesting the trust terms, what he called a no-contest clause. If David tried to challenge my decisions legally, he'd forfeit any inheritance entirely. It wasn't cruel, Harold explained, just protective. After we finished the legal discussion, I asked Harold about something else that had been on my mind. "I'd like to see the harbor property. Could you arrange that?" "Of course. I have the keys right here." He pulled a small key ring from his desk drawer. "Arthur asked me to keep these safe until you were ready. He said you'd know when the time was right." 20 minutes later, I was driving my old Buick down Lighthouse Road, my heart pounding with anticipation. The house was exactly as I remembered it from our drives, a charming 2-story colonial with weathered gray shingles and white trim. The ocean view from the front porch was spectacular, and I could see why Arthur had been drawn to it. Inside, the house was move-in ready. Arthur had furnished it simply but comfortably, a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with new appliances, 2 bedrooms upstairs with views of the harbor. Everything was clean, well-maintained, clearly cared for. He'd been coming here, I realized, probably after his doctor's appointments in town, or during those errands he'd mentioned running. I walked through each room slowly, touching surfaces, opening closets, understanding gradually that Arthur had prepared this place for me, with the same careful attention he'd given everything in our marriage. The bedroom closet even had some of my favorite colors hanging there, clothes I'd never seen before, but chosen with my taste in mind. Standing on the back deck, watching sailboats in the harbor, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure possibility. This wasn't just a house, it was a future. A future I could design myself, without consulting anyone, or asking permission or worrying about what my son thought was appropriate for a woman my age. I pulled out my cell phone and called the number Harold had given me for Janet Mills, a local property manager who handled seasonal rentals. "Mrs. Mills? This is Margaret Calloway. I believe Mr. Bennett mentioned I might call about rental management services." We arranged to meet the following week. Janet sounded efficient and professional, exactly what I needed. By the time I drove home that afternoon, I had a plan forming, not just for the harbor house, but for my entire future. David could make all the suggestions he wanted about assisted living and business investments. Meanwhile, I'd be creating a life he couldn't touch, couldn't control, couldn't even imagine. Arthur had given me more than a house. He'd given me the power to choose my own path forward, and I intended to use every bit of it. I've always believed you can tell more about a person's character by how they react to opportunity than by how they handle hardship. So when David called the following Tuesday, suggesting we continue our conversation about your housing situation, I decided it was time to test exactly what kind of man I'd raised. "Actually, David," I said, using my most helpless widow voice, "I've been thinking about what you said, about selling property and having more money to work with. I might have some options I hadn't considered." The change in his tone was immediate. Suddenly he had plenty of time to talk, plenty of attention for his elderly mother's concerns. "What kind of options, Mom?" "Well, I was going through your father's papers. You know how he kept everything, and I found some documents about a property. I'm not sure I understand it all, but it looks like we might own something else, something valuable." I could practically hear him salivating through the phone. "What kind of property, where?" "I'm not sure, dear. The papers are very confusing. Something about Harbor Road, or Lighthouse Road, and there's a number, 6-something thousand. I can't make sense of it all." I let my voice trail off, sounding overwhelmed and confused. "Mom, this sounds important. I should come over and help you sort through those papers. How about tomorrow evening?" Tomorrow evening. Interesting how his schedule suddenly had openings when money was involved. "Oh, that would be wonderful, David. I hate dealing with all this legal paperwork by myself." He arrived the next day with a briefcase and a hungry look in his eyes. I'd prepared carefully for this visit, scattered some innocuous real estate documents on Arthur's desk, along with a few old bank statements and insurance papers. Nothing about the actual harbor property, of course. I wasn't stupid. "Now, where are those papers you mentioned?" David asked, heading straight for the desk without so much as asking how I was doing. "They're around here somewhere," I said vaguely, shuffling through the documents I'd laid out. "I'm sure I saw something about $600,000, but maybe I was reading it wrong. These numbers are so confusing." 600,000. I watched his reaction carefully. His pupils dilated slightly, and his breathing changed. For just a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw naked greed in my son's face. It was like looking at a stranger. "Mom, this is exactly why you need help managing your affairs," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone again. "Financial documents can be very tricky. Why don't you let me take these papers home and go through them properly? I can organize everything for you." "Take them home?" I blinked at him with wide, innocent eyes. "But what if I need them?" "You won't need them, Mom. I'll handle everything. It's better this way. Less chance of important documents getting lost or damaged." He was already gathering papers into his briefcase. "And Mom, Maybe it's better if we don't mention this to anyone else until I figure out what we're dealing with. You know how people talk in small towns. People talk. Translation, he didn't want anyone else knowing about potential assets until he'd figured out how to get his hands on them. I watched him stuff my deliberately planted decoy papers into his briefcase and felt a cold anger settle in my chest. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, about treating me like I was already incompetent, already a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. After he left, I called Evelyn. Bridge club is tomorrow, isn't it? I asked. 2 o'clock at Dorothy's house, same as always. Why? I was wondering if you might stop by Murphy's Diner for coffee before we head over. I have a feeling we might overhear something interesting. Evelyn was nobody's fool. She'd been married to a banker for 40 years before he passed, and she understood the importance of information. I'll pick you up at noon, she said simply. The next day, we positioned ourselves in a corner booth at Murphy's with clear sight lines to the entire restaurant. Murphy's was where everyone in town came for coffee, gossip, and the kind of conversation that happened when people thought they weren't being overheard. Sure enough, around 12:30, David walked in with Tom Bradley from the hardware store. We couldn't hear everything, but we caught enough. David's voice carrying phrases like finally ready to make some smart decisions and plenty to work with once we get everything organized. Tom looked uncomfortable, kept glancing around like he wished he was somewhere else. But the most damning part came when David lowered his voice and said something about having power of attorney soon and making sure Mom doesn't get confused about what's best for everyone. Power of attorney. He was already planning to take legal control of my finances, my property, my life, without asking me, without even the courtesy of an honest conversation about what I wanted or needed. Evelyn reached across the table and patted my hand. You heard that too, didn't you? I nodded, not trusting my voice. My son, the boy I'd raised, the child I'd sacrificed for, the man I'd loved unconditionally for 52 years, was planning to steal my independence, and he thought I was too stupid or too confused to stop him. Well, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. That afternoon, while we were playing bridge at Dorothy's house, I mentioned casually that David had been so helpful, taking care of some paperwork for me, being so concerned about my welfare. The ladies all made appropriate noises about what a good son he was. But Evelyn caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod. She understood. The game was officially on, and it was time to start playing for keeps. You know what they say about the best-laid plans of mice and men? Well, David was about to discover that his mother wasn't quite the helpless field mouse he thought she was. When he showed up Friday evening with a folder full of legal documents and his most patronizing smile, I was ready for him. Mom, I've been going through those papers you gave me, he announced, settling himself at my kitchen table like he was conducting a board meeting. There are some important decisions we need to make about your financial security. How wonderful that you're taking such good care of me, I said, pouring him coffee in my best china cup. The one with the tiny crack along the handle seemed appropriate somehow. He opened his folder with a flourish. I've prepared some documents that will help protect your assets and make sure all your finances are handled properly. Power of attorney forms, mostly just legal language that lets me help you with banking, property decisions, that sort of thing. Power of attorney. There it was. Exactly what I'd heard him discussing at Murphy's Diner. I picked up the papers and squinted at them, moving them closer to my face and then farther away, playing up the old lady with vision problems routine for all it was worth. Oh my, I said, blinking at the dense legal text. This is all so complicated. What does this part mean? I pointed to a random paragraph, knowing full well that power of attorney meant he could legally make decisions about my property without consulting me. Don't worry about the details, Mom. It's just paperwork. The important thing is that it protects you from having to deal with confusing financial matters. His voice had that smooth, reassuring quality that probably worked well with his business clients. Unfortunately for him, I'd been listening to smooth-talking men for longer than he'd been alive. I set the papers down and rubbed my temples. I'm sorry, David. I'm just not feeling very clear-headed today. Maybe it's all the stress of losing your father. Could we do this another time, when I'm thinking more clearly? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom, these documents are time-sensitive. The sooner we get your affairs organized, the better protected you'll be. Time sensitive? I blinked at him with wide, confused eyes. What happens if we wait a few days? He couldn't answer that without admitting the documents weren't time sensitive at all, they were just convenient for his timeline. Well, nothing terrible would happen, but then let's wait until I'm feeling more myself, I said firmly, pushing the papers back toward him. I promise we'll take care of it soon. After he left, clearly frustrated, but unable to push too hard without revealing his true motives, I had some phone calls to make. First to Harold Bennett, letting him know about David's power of attorney attempt. Harold's response was succinct, "Don't sign anything until we've reviewed it together." Then I called Janet Mills about the Harbor House. We'd met earlier in the week, and she'd been enthusiastic about the rental potential. "Mrs. Calloway, I've already had 3 inquiries for summer bookings. If you're ready to move forward, we could have your first tenants by Memorial Day weekend." Ready to move forward? Was I ever? "Janet, let's do it. And I'd like to handle the arrangements discreetly for now. Family reasons. Of course, many of our property owners prefer to keep their rental income private. I'll set up everything under your maiden name, just as the property is titled." Over the next 2 weeks, while David kept calling to ask about those important papers, I was quietly transforming myself from dependent widow to independent businesswoman. Janet and I met at the Harbor House to discuss furnishings and improvements. I hired Bobby Morrison, Doc Morrison's grandson, to do some minor repairs and touch-up painting. I contracted with Henderson's flower shop to maintain the gardens. All of this activity was happening in plain sight, but in a different part of town from where David usually spent his time. Small-town networks are funny things. Information flows freely within each circle, but between circles, that's where secrets can hide in broad daylight. I also made some changes closer to home, had a security system installed in my main house, nothing fancy, just cameras and motion sensors. For my peace of mind, I told the installer, "At my age, you can't be too careful." The system came with an app that let me monitor everything from my phone, including recordings of anyone who came to my door. And I started carrying a small digital recorder in my purse, an old habit from my secretary days at the insurance office, back when I needed to take dictation accurately. Funny how old skills come back when you need them. The third time David came by with those power of attorney papers, I was ready. I set the recorder running before he even sat down, and I made sure to ask him very specific questions about what the documents would allow him to do. "So if I sign this, you could sell my house without asking me?" "Well, technically yes, but I would never. And you could move my money around to different accounts?" "Only to better protect your assets, Mom. And if you wanted to invest my money in your business, you could do that?" A pause. A telling pause. "Mom, I think you're overthinking this. It's just a safety measure." But the pause was enough. The hesitation before answering was recorded, along with his non-denial of my direct question. Harold Bennett had taught me long ago that in legal matters, what people don't say is often more important than what they do say. I kept that recording safe in Arthur's old desk, right next to the documents about the harbor property that David still didn't know existed. My secret weapons, waiting for the right moment to use them. Because that moment was coming, I could feel it in the way David's patience was wearing thin, in the increasing frequency of his visits, in the barely concealed frustration in his voice when I continued to misplace his important papers. He was planning something bigger. I could sense it, and when he made his move, I'd be ready for him. Sometimes life hands you gifts when you least expect them. 3 weeks after David's last unsuccessful attempt to get me to sign those power of attorney papers, I received a call from First National Bank. Arthur had maintained a safety deposit box there that I'd completely forgotten about. Apparently, the annual fee was paid automatically from an account I'd never known existed. "Mrs. Calloway," the bank manager said, "we're updating our records and noticed that you're the sole surviving key holder. Would you like to arrange access to the box?" The next morning, I found myself in the basement vault of First National, following a young clerk to box number 247. My hands shook slightly as I turned the key. Arthur had kept this secret for who knows how long, just like the house. What else had my practical husband arranged for me? Inside the metal box were documents I'd never seen, bearer bonds worth $75,000, and a handwritten list of names and phone numbers. Business contacts from Arthur's banking days, men he'd trusted and worked with over the years. Most of the names I recognized, other bankers, lawyers, a few local businessmen who'd been Arthur's friends. One name jumped out at me: Judge William Hartwell, retired. I'd known Bill Hartwell socially for years. He and his wife Emma had been in our bridge circle before Emma passed, but I'd never thought of him as one of Arthur's business contacts. The notation next to his name read legal advice. Margaret can trust him completely. I took the list home and called Judge Hartwell that very afternoon. Bill, it's Maggie Calloway. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I found your name in Arthur's papers, and I'm dealing with some family complications. Maggie, his voice was warm and familiar. Arthur mentioned you might need some guidance eventually. Why don't you come by for coffee tomorrow? We should talk. Judge Hartwell lived in a gracious colonial on Elm Street, the kind of house that spoke of old money and older wisdom. His study was lined floor to ceiling with law books, and he settled me into a comfortable chair before pouring coffee from a silver service that probably belonged to his grandmother. Arthur was worried about David, he said, without preamble. Bill Hartwell had never been one to waste time on pleasantries when serious matters were at hand. He came to see me about 6 months before he passed, asked some hypothetical questions about protecting assets from family members with poor judgment. I told him everything. About David's pressure to sell the house, about the assisted living suggestions, about the power of attorney documents he kept pushing. I even told him about the harbor property, though I swore him to secrecy on that detail. Bill listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Margaret, I think we need to take some preventive action. What David's doing isn't illegal yet, but it's heading in that direction." He helped me draft a letter to Harold Bennett, outlining specific instructions for my trust. The harbor property and the bearer bonds would be protected in a way that bypassed David entirely. If something happened to me, they'd go directly to fund a scholarship at the community college in Arthur's name. The scholarship would be managed by a board of trustees including Judge Hartwell, Harold Bennett, and Reverend Matthews from the church. This serves several purposes, Bill explained as we reviewed the documents. First, it protects those assets from any family disputes. Second, it creates a legal structure that would be very difficult and expensive for David to challenge. And third, it honors Arthur's memory in a way the community will respect. The scholarship fund would provide annual awards for students studying business or finance, the subjects Arthur had devoted his career to. It was perfect, meaningful, legally bulletproof, and completely outside David's reach or knowledge. We also drafted a formal letter documenting David's attempts to pressure me into signing financial documents. Nothing accusatory or harsh, just a clear statement of facts that could be used later if needed. Bill suggested I keep copies with multiple people: Harold, himself, and Evelyn Parker. "Think of it as insurance," he said. "Hopefully you'll never need it. But if David escalates his pressure tactics, you'll have documentation of a pattern of behavior." Over the next week, I quietly implemented all of Bill's suggestions. The scholarship fund was established and funded with the bearer bonds Arthur had left me. The Harbor House Trust was revised to include the scholarship as the ultimate beneficiary. I even opened a separate checking account for the rental income, keeping it completely separate from my regular finances. Janet Mills called with wonderful news. "We had bookings for the Harbor House through Labor Day. Your property is going to be quite profitable, Mrs. Calloway. The ocean view and the proximity to town make it very desirable." Profitable indeed. Between the rental income, Arthur's pension, and my Social Security, I was more financially secure than I'd ever been in my life, more secure, and completely independent of my son's help. The irony wasn't lost on me. David was so focused on getting control of what he thought were my assets that he had no idea I was building a completely separate life, a life where his opinions and his schemes were utterly irrelevant. Arthur's final gift wasn't just the house or the bonds, it was the freedom to live on my own terms, and I intended to use every bit of that freedom, starting with making sure my son learned some long overdue lessons about respect, honesty, and the consequences of underestimating your mother. The stage was set. Now I just had to wait for David to make his next move. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late May, just as I was enjoying coffee on my back porch and reviewing the reservation schedule Janet had sent for the Harbor House. David's voice was different, harder, more businesslike than I'd ever heard it. "Mom, I need to see you today. I'm bringing someone with me to discuss your situation." 2 o'clock. Not asking if 2 o'clock was convenient, not asking if I wanted to meet with someone about my situation, just announcing his intentions like I was an employee who'd been summoned to a meeting. The tone told me everything I needed to know. David was done being patient, done pretending to care about my feelings or preferences. "Of course, dear," I said sweetly. "Should I make coffee for your friend?" "That won't be necessary. This is a business meeting." A business meeting, about me, apparently, but not including me as an equal participant. I hung up the phone and immediately called Harold Bennett. "Harold, I need you at my house at 2 o'clock today. David is bringing someone, probably a lawyer, and I suspect he's going to try to have me declared incompetent." "I'll be there at 1:30, Harold said without hesitation. "And Margaret? Don't say anything until I arrive. Nothing at all." I spent the morning preparing, gathered all my recent financial documents, bank statements, the property management contracts for the Harbor House, receipts for the home security system, documentation of the scholarship fund, proof that I'd been making complex, intelligent decisions about my affairs for months. I also set up my phone to record the conversation, perfectly legal in New Hampshire, as long as one party to the conversation consents, and I certainly consented to recording my own business meeting. Harold arrived early as promised, and we reviewed my documentation together. "This is excellent, Margaret. You've been busier than I realized. Any judge would look at this level of financial activity and planning and conclude you're completely competent." At exactly 2 o'clock, David arrived with a man I didn't recognize. Young, expensive suit, briefcase, the kind of lawyer who probably charged by the minute. They walked into my living room like they owned it, barely acknowledging Harold's presence. "Mom," David said, not bothering with pleasantries, "this is attorney Richard Sterling. We need to discuss your capacity to manage your own affairs." My capacity, not my finances, not my preferences, not what I wanted for my future. My capacity, like I was a machine that needed to be evaluated for proper functioning. Attorney Sterling opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Mrs. Calloway, your son is concerned about some recent confusion you've experienced regarding important financial decisions. He's requested that we explore options for ensuring your assets are properly protected." "What confusion might that be?" I asked mildly, settling back in my chair like I had all day to listen to their theories about my mental state. David jumped in. "Mom, you've been unable to understand the power of attorney documents I've been trying to help you with. You keep losing important papers, forgetting our conversations about your housing situation. It's clear that managing your finances has become overwhelming for you." I looked at Harold, who gave me the slightest nod. Time to show my cards. "David, I haven't been confused about those power of attorney documents. I've been unwilling to sign them. There's a significant difference." I reached into the folder beside my chair and pulled out the recording device. "In fact, I recorded our conversations about them. Would you like to hear the part where you admitted those documents would allow you to sell my house without my permission?" The silence in the room was deafening. Attorney Sterling looked at David with the expression of a man who'd just realized his client hadn't been entirely honest about the situation. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out my financial documents, "here are the contracts I've negotiated for seasonal rental management of investment property. Here are the receipts for a security system I researched and purchased. Here's documentation for a charitable scholarship fund I established and manage. These are the activities of someone who's confused about financial matters." Harold leaned forward slightly. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about Mrs. Calloway's mental state. As you can see from these documents, she's been making sophisticated financial decisions and managing complex transactions for months." Attorney Sterling was studying my papers with the focused attention of someone trying to figure out how badly he'd miscalculated. "Mrs. Calloway, your son indicated that you'd been experiencing memory problems, difficulty understanding documents." "My son," I said clearly, "has been frustrated that I won't sign documents giving him control over my assets so he can use them to fund his business ventures. That frustration seems to have been misinterpreted as evidence of my incapacity." David's face was red with embarrassment and anger. "Mom, I was trying to help you." "Help me? What, David? Help me give you access to my money? Help me move into assisted living so you could sell my house? Help me sign away my independence so you wouldn't have to be bothered with actually caring about my well-being?" The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I was tired. Tired of pretending, tired of protecting his feelings while he plotted to steal my autonomy, tired of being treated like a burden instead of a person. Attorney Sterling was already packing up his briefcase. "Mr. Calloway, I think this consultation is concluded. Your mother appears to be fully competent and well represented by counsel. I don't see any grounds for the action you described." After they left, David storming out without a word, Sterling looking professionally embarrassed, Harold and I sat in the quiet of my living room for a few minutes. "Well," he said finally, "I don't think David will be bothering you with any more legal challenges." "No," I agreed, "but I don't think this is over. He's humiliated, and he's desperate. That's a dangerous combination." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Margaret, I think it's time to make your independence very public, visible, let the community see exactly how well you're managing your affairs." I smiled, thinking about the Harbor House, about the scholarship fund, about all the plans I'd been making in secret. "Harold, I think you're absolutely right. It's time to stop hiding." There's something liberating about deciding to stop hiding who you really are. For months, I'd been playing the part of the confused widow, letting David and everyone else underestimate me while I quietly built a life he couldn't touch. But after that confrontation with his lawyer, I realized the time for secrecy was over. I called Janet Mills first thing Wednesday morning. "Janet, I'd like to host a small gathering at the Harbor House this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just coffee and pastries for some friends who've been supportive during my transition to widowhood." "What a lovely idea, Mrs. Calloway. The house will be perfect for entertaining. Should I arrange for catering?" "Just coffee service and some treats from Hartley's Bakery. I want it to feel welcoming, not formal." What I wanted was for word to spread naturally through town that Margaret Calloway owned waterfront property and was managing it beautifully. I invited carefully Evelyn Parker and the Bridge Club ladies, Reverend Matthews and his wife Doc Morrison, and several other longtime friends, Harold Bennett, Judge Hartwell, and a few of Arthur's former colleagues from the bank. People who'd known us for decades, who understood the difference between genuine concern and opportunistic manipulation. Saturday morning dawned clear and beautiful, perfect for showcasing the Harbor House's ocean views. I arrived early to arrange flowers and make sure everything was perfect. The house looked spectacular. Janet's management had kept it immaculate, and the morning light streaming through the windows made the whole place glow. My guests began arriving around 10 o'clock, and their reactions were everything I could have hoped for. Evelyn took one look at the view and said, "Maggie Calloway, you've been holding out on us. This place is magnificent." Reverend Matthews was equally impressed. "Margaret, Arthur would be so proud to see you managing all this so beautifully. What a wonderful retreat this must be for you." I gave them a tour of the house, explaining how Arthur had secretly purchased it as a gift for me, how I'd been learning about property management and seasonal rentals. I mentioned the income potential, the bookings through Labor Day, the professional management company I'd contracted with. Every detail demonstrated competence, planning, successful execution of complex decisions. Doc Morrison, sharp as ever at 85, understood immediately what I was really showing them. "Margaret, you've built yourself quite an impressive little business here. Arthur always said you were the smart one in the family." Judge Hartwell raised his coffee cup in a toast to Margaret Calloway, who's proving that the best chapters in life can begin at any age. By Monday, the story was all over town. I knew because Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop called to congratulate me on my beautiful property venture, and because the mailman mentioned how impressive it was that I'd managed such a complex project so successfully. Tuesday brought an unexpected bonus, a call from Jennifer Walsh at the Millfield Gazette, our weekly newspaper.
"Mrs. Calloway,
"I've been hearing wonderful things about your property restoration project. Would you be interested in being featured in our local success stories column?" A newspaper feature. Perfect. I'd be honored, Jennifer. The interview was scheduled for Thursday morning at the Harbor House. Jennifer, who was Dorothy Walsh's granddaughter and a journalism major at the State University, asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of managing rental property, about maintaining a historic home, about my plans for the future. "What advice would you give to other widows who might be afraid to take on new challenges?" she asked. "Trust yourself more than you trust other people's opinions about what you can handle," I replied. "Age brings experience, and experience is the best foundation for making good decisions." Don't let anyone convince you that getting older means becoming less capable. The article appeared the following week with the headline, Local Widow Turns Hidden Gift into Thriving Business. The photograph showed me on the Harbor House deck, smiling at the camera with the ocean behind me. I looked confident, successful, completely in control of my life. The response was immediate and gratifying. Phone calls from old friends, congratulations from neighbors, even inquiries from other property owners asking for advice about rental management. The whole town now knew that Margaret Calloway was nobody's victim, nobody's burden, nobody's confused elderly relative who needed managing. David called that evening. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom, I saw the newspaper article. We need to talk." "Do we? About what?" "About this house you apparently own. About why you never mentioned it when we were discussing your financial situation." "David, you never asked about my financial situation. You told me what you thought I should do about my financial situation. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment, probably trying to figure out how to handle this new version of his mother, the one who owned valuable property he couldn't touch and had the whole town's respect for managing it successfully. "I think we need to meet and clear the air," he said finally. "I think the air is perfectly clear," I replied. "You wanted to control my assets for your benefit. I chose to control them for mine. The situation has resolved itself exactly as it should have." After I hung up, I sat on my back porch watching the sunset and feeling more satisfied than I had in years. The scared, confused widow was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to show it. Arthur's gift hadn't just been a house. It had been the chance to discover who I really was when nobody was trying to diminish me, manage me, or make me smaller than I actually was. And what I discovered was someone I rather liked, someone strong enough to build a new life and wise enough to protect it. 3 months later, I'm sitting on the deck of my harbor house watching the sunrise paint the water gold and pink, thinking about the strange turns life can take when you least expect them. The morning is perfect, calm water, gentle breeze, the sound of seagulls calling to each other as they hunt for breakfast in the shallows. My first season as a property manager has been more successful than I dared hope. Janet tells me we're already booking for next summer, and the rental income has exceeded our projections by 20%. I've used some of that money to make improvements to both houses. New gutters for the main house, professional landscaping for the harbor property, a few small luxuries I'd denied myself for years. But the real victory isn't financial. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing I chose my own path forward, made my own decisions, built something meaningful with my own hands and mind. Every time I unlock this front door, every time I watch new guests discover the beauty of this place, I remember that I did this, not David, not some financial advisor, not some well-meaning friend who thought I needed managing. David and I have reached what you might call an understanding. He calls occasionally, keeps his distance mostly, treats me with a cautious respect that's probably the best our relationship can be now. I think he finally understands that his mother isn't the helpless widow he thought she was, and I've accepted that my son may never be the caring man I'd hoped he'd become. Some truths are painful but necessary. The community has embraced my transformation in ways that still surprise me. I've been asked to speak at the senior center about managing finances after loss, and I've been invited to join the Chamber of Commerce as a business owner. The scholarship fund Arthur and I established has awarded its first grants, 2 young people studying finance and business management, exactly what Arthur would have wanted. Judge Hartwell stops by occasionally for coffee and conversation about everything from local politics to investment strategies. "Margaret," he told me last week, "you've become one of the most interesting people in town." Arthur would be proud, but I don't think he'd be surprised. This morning, I have the house to myself for a few hours before the next guests arrive. A young couple from Boston, celebrating their first wedding anniversary. I remember being that young, that hopeful about the future, that certain that love would be enough to handle whatever came next. Arthur and I were lucky. Love was enough, mostly for 53 good years. But I've learned something important in these months since his death. Love isn't always enough to protect you from other people's assumptions about what you can handle, what you deserve, what you're capable of accomplishing. Sometimes you have to protect yourself, make your own choices, prove your own worth to people who should already know it. I think about the letter I wrote to David last week. Not angry, not accusing, just honest. I told him about the harbor house, about the scholarship fund, about the decisions I'd made without his input or approval. I explained that I'd kept things private, not out of confusion or inability to communicate, but out of a need to prove to myself that I could still build something meaningful and new. I hope someday you'll understand, I wrote, that respecting someone means trusting their judgment, not trying to replace it with your own. I love you, but I don't need you to manage my life. I need you to respect the life I choose to live. I never sent the letter. Some conversations are better held in your own heart, some explanations are more for your own clarity than for changing someone else's mind. David will either learn to see me as I actually am, or he won't. Either way, I'll be fine. The sun is fully up now, turning the water from gold to brilliant blue. A sailboat is heading out from the harbor. Early morning sailors who understand the joy of being on the water when the world is quiet and full of possibility. I wave from my deck and they wave back, strangers sharing a moment of appreciation for this beautiful place we're lucky enough to call home. In a few hours, this deck will be full of wedding anniversary celebration, champagne toasts, and young love planning its future. Tonight, it will be empty again, except for me and my coffee and my satisfaction with the life I've built. Arthur's final gift wasn't just property or money or even independence. It was permission to be fully myself, to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world, to trust my own judgment about what makes a life worth living. At 82, I'm just getting started on the most interesting chapter of my story. I finish my coffee, gather my cup, and head inside to prepare for my guests. There's work to do, a business to run, a life to live on my own terms. Arthur would be proud, but more importantly, I'm proud. And that, it turns out, makes all the difference. The key turns smoothly in the lock as I prepare to welcome new guests to my little piece of paradise. Behind me, the ocean stretches endlessly toward the horizon, full of possibilities I'm finally ready to explore.